It all started with a simple mistake. There seems to be a mistake, sir. We need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger, Jessica, the flight attendant said, her voice polite, but carrying an undercurrent of condescension. She glanced at the seat in front of Marcus, who sat calmly with his tablet, unaware of what was about to unfold. This seat is reserved for only our platinum members. You don't belong and can't sit here. Behind her stood Karen Wickfield, a sharply dressed woman with a designer handbag and impatience etched on her face. She tapped her expensive watch, eyes darting between Marcus and the seat she clearly believed was hers. I always sit there, Karen muttered, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. It's practically my seat. Marcus looked up from his tablet, confusion crossing his face. He had done everything right, booked early, paid in full, arrived on time, and yet somehow he was being told to vacate his seat. I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat, Marcus said calmly, his tone measured as he reached for his wallet and pulled out his platinum member card. I'm a platinum member, and this is my assigned seat. Jessica's smile tightened. She glanced down at the card for a brief moment, but it didn't seem to faze her. I understand, sir, but this particular seat is typically reserved for a better customer, she said, her eyes flicking over to Karen with a clear implication. We prioritize regular platinum members, like Miss Wickfield, who flies with us frequently. The message was clear. Marcus, despite his platinum status, didn't belong in that seat. It was meant for someone with more influence, someone with the right look and the right status. The rest of the first-class cabin had started to notice the interaction. A few people pulled out their phones, and whispers spread quickly through the rows. The flight crew didn't know it yet, but they were about to make a huge mistake, one that would have ramifications far beyond their control. Marcus remained calm, standing his ground. But behind his calm exterior, the weight of the situation began to settle in. He had been treated unfairly, not just as a customer, but as a person. This simple act of discrimination would change everything. Not just for Marcus, but for Skylux Airlines too. It would be a lesson in karma. Have you ever been treated unfairly simply because of how you looked? Drop your experiences in the comments below. If you stand against prejudice and injustice, hit that subscribe button now and type justice along with where you're watching from in the comment section. Marcus wasn't just any passenger. At 42, Marcus Richardson was the founder and CEO of RightTech Solutions, a $2.8 billion company specializing in AI-driven customer service technology. His software helped businesses identify and eliminate bias in customer interactions, a service he had built from scratch with blood, sweat, and relentless work. Ironically, Marcus's own encounter on this flight was about to be a textbook example of the bias he worked to eliminate. Marcus's story began long before he was the CEO of a tech giant. Growing up in South Chicago, he had learned to code at the age of 11 on a second-hand computer. While other kids played video games, Marcus created them, designing simple programs that gradually evolved into complex algorithms. It wasn't an easy path. When Marcus was 16, his father was killed in a tragic incident that shook his community. Standing at his father's grave, young Marcus made a promise that would define his life: to ensure people saw each other as human beings first, not by their skin color, background, or economic status. That promise fueled 2 decades of relentless work. Marcus built his company from the ground up, coding for 18 hours a day while working odd jobs to make ends meet. He knew the grind. It wasn't glamorous, but it was necessary. Every sacrifice he made, every sleepless night, brought him one step closer to the man he was today. Earlier that day, at the airport, Marcus had been seen helping an elderly woman struggling with her luggage. He patiently guided her through the terminal, held doors open for strangers, thanked every service worker by name, and tipped generously at the cafe. It wasn't because he was being watched, but because it was just who Marcus was, humble despite his success, kind despite his power. But now, sitting in his first-class seat, he wasn't just any passenger. He had earned his place, and yet the flight crew seemed intent on taking it from him. Marcus was headed to deliver the keynote address at the Global Ethics and Technology Conference. He had chosen Skylux Airlines because it was the epitome of luxury air travel. The airline's first-class seats were more expensive than some people's monthly rent, and platinum members received top-tier service. Heated towels, champagne, and reclining seats that turned into full beds. It was supposed to be a seamless, luxurious experience. But instead, Marcus was being treated as if he didn't belong. The flight attendant's eyes darted nervously between Marcus and Karen. Jessica Miller, the flight attendant, had worked at Skylux for 8 years. She prided herself on knowing the preferences of the regular first-class passengers. She always made sure Karen Wickfield got her seat. Seat 2A, the one Marcus had been assigned. But what Jessica didn't know was that the man sitting in that seat was not just any regular customer. She had bills to pay, and Karen's generous tips helped cover her mortgage. Jessica knew she could not afford to lose Karen as a customer. But as she stood there, a knot formed in her stomach. She felt the pressure building. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but it was easier to go along with it. After all, Karen was a regular, and Marcus was just another passenger, right? "Sir, we have a platinum member who always sits in this particular seat," Jessica said, her voice forced and polite. "Would you mind moving to another seat?" Her tone implied this was a simple request, but it carried a subtle message. Marcus should comply without question. He had the right to be there, but his presence was now an inconvenience. Marcus paused for a moment, looking up at her. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," he replied. He showed her his boarding pass and platinum member card. Jessica hesitated. Her eyes darted to Karen, who was now standing in the aisle, visibly annoyed. Karen's frustration was clear. "I always sit there on this route. It's practically my seat," she said loudly enough for the other passengers to hear. The tension in the cabin thickened. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something wasn't right. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in another section?" Jessica suggested, her voice betraying her discomfort. She wasn't offering Marcus another first-class seat, just a way to get him out of the way. Marcus's response was simple but firm. "No thank you. I've selected this seat specifically for the legroom. I need to work during the flight." The situation was escalating, and others were starting to notice. As Jessica moved to the front of the cabin, Marcus settled back into his seat. But he knew this wasn't over. It was clear that Skylux Airlines had a bias problem, and it was about to unfold for everyone to see. The captain, Trevor, had arrived. His expression was one of rigid authority, the kind of demeanor one expected from someone used to having his commands followed without question. "Sir, we need you to move to accommodate our VIP passenger," Trevor announced, his tone booming across the cabin. He stood tall, towering over Marcus. "I've shown my boarding pass and platinum status," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm but unwavering. "This is my assigned seat." Trevor's face tightened as he leaned closer to Marcus. His voice dropped slightly, but the passengers could still hear every word. "Perhaps you're unfamiliar with how things work on this airline," Trevor said, his voice dripping with disdain. "We accommodate worthy customers who have specific preferences." Marcus looked around. The passengers were watching now, some recording the interaction. He was aware of the growing tension, but he remained composed. "I'm not moving," he said quietly, yet firmly. "This is my seat." The confrontation continued to escalate as passengers watched, phones recording. Marcus's refusal to comply didn't sit well with Trevor, who felt his authority slipping away. His next move was to make it clear that this wasn't just a simple seating issue. This was about power. But Marcus wasn't intimidated. Trevor turned to the flight attendants. "We need to handle this quickly. Can we move him to a different seat?" The conversation was barely whispered, but the whispers were becoming louder. Passengers exchanged knowing looks. Some were starting to realize what was happening. The tension in the cabin was palpable as Trevor spoke urgently into the service phone. Marcus had remained seated the entire time, his composure unshaken, his focus on the presentation he was preparing for the Global Ethics and Technology Conference. He knew that this situation had already become a test of character, and he was determined not to let it escalate any further. Trevor returned to the front of the cabin after a few minutes, clearly flustered. His attempts to intimidate Marcus had failed. But now the situation was becoming something much bigger than a seating dispute. The cockpit door opened and Captain James Reynolds stepped out, his face stern and professional. He walked toward Marcus, his posture rigid and imposing. Jessica followed closely behind, looking visibly uncomfortable with what was happening. Trevor led the way as Captain Reynolds stopped next to Marcus's seat. He towered over Marcus, attempting to assert his authority. "Sir," the captain began, his voice measured but firm, "I understand there's a situation." He didn't even look directly at Marcus. "My crew has the authority to assign seats as needed for the comfort and convenience of all passengers." Marcus, who had been calm throughout this entire exchange, looked up at the captain and met his gaze without hesitation. "Captain, with all due respect," Marcus replied, his voice steady, "I have a confirmed seat assignment, and I am a Platinum member. I selected this specific seat for the legroom I need to work during the flight. There is no policy that requires me to give up my assigned seat to another passenger who simply prefers it." The tension in the cabin deepened as the conversation turned into a power struggle between Marcus and the airline crew. Trevor, clearly frustrated, smirked. "Sir, if you continue to be uncooperative," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "we'll have no choice but to remove you from the flight." The threat hung in the air. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. They were witnessing an injustice unfold, and the air was thick with discomfort. Many of them had pulled out their phones by now, recording everything. Marcus's calm resolve in the face of such hostility was striking. His demeanor made it clear. This wasn't just a matter of being inconvenienced. It was a matter of standing up for what was right. For a brief moment, Marcus was taken aback by the audacity of the captain's words. Was he really being threatened with removal for occupying the seat he had paid for, the seat assigned to him? "Are you threatening to remove me because I won't give up the seat I paid for?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Before the captain could respond, Karen's voice pierced the tension, rising dramatically, in a way that made it clear she was enjoying the chaos she had caused. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, her voice echoing through the cabin. "I'm going to miss my connection. I have never been treated this poorly in all my years of flying." The irony of her words was not lost on the other passengers, who exchanged looks of disbelief. Some were visibly uncomfortable, and others were outright angry, but most remained silent, unsure how to navigate the situation. Captain Reynolds, sensing that this situation had gone beyond what he was prepared for, squared his shoulders and adopted a more authoritative tone. "This is your final warning," he said, his voice cold and firm. "Move to another seat, or we'll call security." Marcus, however, was done with the back and forth. He had already made up his mind. There was no way he was going to comply with such unjust demands. It was at this moment that Marcus slowly reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. The simple act of pulling out his phone seemed to shift the dynamics of the situation. He opened his camera app and began recording. "I want to be clear about what's happening here," Marcus said calmly, his voice carrying the weight of the situation. "I'm being threatened with removal from this flight because I won't give up my assigned seat to another passenger who wants it." The captain's face immediately contorted with anger. The legalities of Marcus recording the situation seemed to hit home, and Trevor, in a panic, reached for Marcus's phone. His hand was just a hair away from grabbing it. "Recording is not permitted," Trevor snapped, his voice rising in anger. He made another attempt to grab the phone, but Marcus pulled it away with swift precision. "Actually," Marcus said evenly, "there's no federal law prohibiting recording on an aircraft unless it interferes with crew duties. I'm simply documenting this interaction for my own protection." Trevor's face turned red with frustration. He stopped in his tracks, his hand falling back to his side. The realization that Marcus knew his rights was enough to make him hesitate. He stood there, seething, but said nothing more. The situation escalated even further. Just as the tension seemed to reach its peak, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the cabin, signaling that things were about to take a drastic turn. They moved down the aisle with purpose, following Trevor's gestures. Marcus remained seated, his back straight, his posture impeccable. Despite the humiliation being inflicted upon him, he maintained his dignity. His phone was still recording, capturing the unfolding events for his own protection. The first security officer approached Marcus's seat and, in a tone that was anything but friendly, said, "Sir, we've been informed there's a situation requiring your removal from the aircraft." Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the officer's presence, but his expression remained calm and controlled. "I'd like to understand the specific airline policy I'm violating," he said, his voice clear and measured. "I'm sitting in my assigned seat with a valid boarding pass and platinum status." The officer glanced over at the other security officer, who exchanged an uncomfortable look with his partner. It was clear that they had been called in to remove a passenger who had violated no rules. "You need to gather your belongings and come with us," the second officer said, avoiding the question entirely. Marcus didn't flinch. He stood up slowly, still maintaining his composure. As he gathered his things, the cabin was filled with murmurs. Passengers were still recording, and a few of them began to voice their disapproval. "You don't deserve this," one passenger said. "He hasn't done anything wrong." As Marcus walked down the aisle toward the front of the plane, he passed by Trevor. The smug look on Trevor's face from earlier had disappeared, replaced by an uneasy expression. It was as if he realized too late the magnitude of the situation, and then the real twist. As Marcus passed by Trevor, Karen, who had been watching the entire scene unfold with barely contained satisfaction, slipped another folded bill into Trevor's pocket. "Thanks for handling that situation," she whispered, loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. The passengers, now fully aware of what had just transpired, began to speak out. Some were recording, while others voiced their disbelief at what had just happened. First class should have standards. Karen muttered under her breath, her satisfaction evident. The implication of her words hung in the air like a poisonous cloud. But what Karen didn't realize was that the entire cabin had witnessed this exchange. It had been caught on video. Marcus's humiliation wasn't just about being escorted off the plane. It was about something much bigger, the consequences of a corrupt system that allowed this behavior to continue unchecked. The aftermath was swift and brutal. As Marcus was escorted off the plane by security, he texted his COO, Elise. "I was removed from a Skylux flight, but they picked the wrong person to humiliate." His message was clear. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. Back at Skylux Airlines headquarters, things were already spiraling out of control. The video was quickly spreading across social media, reaching millions. Celebrities were starting to amplify the story, and major news outlets were picking it up. The PR disaster was unfolding in real time, and Skylux's CEO, Richard Williams, was about to face the consequences of his employees' actions. As Marcus sat in the airport lounge, his legal team was already preparing for battle. Within minutes of his text to Elise, she arrived with the head of legal and their chief communications officer. The room buzzed with urgency. The video had already hit 2 million views, and the fallout had begun. "We need to handle this now," Elise said, her tone reflecting the gravity of the situation. "This is bigger than just a simple seating dispute." Marcus knew exactly what needed to be done. Skylux needed to be held accountable for their actions, and he would ensure they paid the price. The injustice he had faced on that flight would not be ignored.